Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock, and as of this recording, it is August 8th, 2024. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time to introduce myself and explain to the audience why it is that I wanted to make this podcast in the first place and a little bit about my background. I graduated high school in 2012, enlisted straight away into the United States Army as an infantryman. I served with the 75th Ranger Regiment for the entirety of my enlistment. I did 2 combat rotations in Afghanistan, and after 4 years of back-to-back training cycles, deployments, and an ungodly amount of time spent in the hell known as Ranger School, I decided that I had had enough, cashed in my GI Bill, and attended the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, where I graduated with a bachelor's in information systems. And currently, I live in Colorado Springs and work supporting the United States Space Force as a cybersecurity analyst. As an infantryman, I feel a duty to, at the very least, educate myself and preserve the memory, experiences, and lessons learned from all those who died, suffered, and were horribly, horribly treated on their return to the United States during the Vietnam War. As a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, I can't help but see the parallels between that conflict and the Vietnam conflict. And the more I've learned about the Vietnam conflict, the more it just blows my mind that politicians and generals who've been around since the Vietnam era allowed this to happen again. And it just makes me feel that no lessons will ever be learned. Now, if you're a bit of a pessimist, or maybe it's just being a realist, you know that humanity is more or less doomed to repeat all its same mistakes because nobody wants to learn from the past. But as an infantryman, I feel a special connection to those who served in Vietnam, who were there in the jungles fighting. And even though the morality of the war can be called in question, or the utility of the war can be called in question, the fact remains that these were people who answered the call of their nation and, like it or not, did the work, as some in today's modern era like to use as a bit of a phraseology. You want to know who did the work? The infantrymen. The infantrymen always do the work. And, you know, it's not just the infantrymen. I just am an infantryman, so I'm a little bit biased here. But anybody who was there in Vietnam answered the call. They did the work. And oftentimes, they were not treated very well by the citizens of this great land upon their return. But we'll get to all that in the course of time. By now, you probably get the gist of my motivations for this podcast. So I digress. I'll go ahead and step down off my soapbox. And I'll go ahead and get back to the war in Vietnam.
War in Vietnam? War in Viet-fucking-Nam!
Everybody generally knows that the war in Vietnam was a pretty insane time. And to me, there are some aspects of this conflict that are very fascinating. The complexity, the distinctions between Eastern and Western culture, communism versus capitalism, an agrarian society versus an industrialism society, all of it. All of it is extremely interesting to me. And I hope that you'll take away some new lessons learned based on the narrative that I give about this war. Here's a few facts to get us started. It was a continuation of the decolonization process that began at the end of World War II. It pitted the United States against North Vietnam, China, and the Soviet Union. It was an epically brutal and bloody war of attrition for the dominance of one ideology over another in Vietnam. 58,202 U.S. personnel perished in Vietnam, with 304,704 wounded. 23,038 missing in action, 766 prisoners of war. And of our killed in action, at least 25,000 of them were estimated to be 20 years old or younger. Our South Vietnamese allies lost 223,748 soldiers killed in action, with an estimated 1.7 million wounded in action. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong combined total killed in action is estimated at 1.1 million, with 600,000 wounded in action and 26,000 taken prisoners of war. The estimated civilian casualties and deaths range from 400,000 to 600,000. In total, across all sides, military and civilian deaths are estimated at 1.35 million. 14 million tons of explosives were dropped in Vietnam. That's more than twice as much as during World War II. The North Vietnamese won control of the country, and the nation of Vietnam that we know of today was legitimized by their success against the United States back then. U.S. soldiers returning home were many times met by jeers, sneers, curses, fists, and flying objects hurled by anti-war protesters. And the Vietnam War was a war of attrition in hilly, hot, and humid jungle terrain dense with elephant grass, bamboo, palms, poisonous vipers, poisonous spiders, poisonous centipedes, and fire ants. Not to forget the monkeys, tigers, and panthers. Summertime highs reached up to and beyond 100 degrees in some cases, with 100% humidity. It made a man feel like he was being baked alive in a steam room. A U.S. soldier's average tour of duty was 365 days, and the infantrymen averaged 240 days of combat, compared with an average 10 days for an infantryman in combat during World War II. 1/3 of soldiers were volunteers, 2/3 were draftees, and those are just a few of the many statistics and facts that come from this war. As a soldier, but more especially as an infantryman, I feel a duty to remember and preserve the stories of those who found themselves in harsh times and ended up paying the ultimate sacrifice or suffered extremely for the decisions made by politicians and generals sitting somewhere behind the wire, letting youngsters do their dirty work. Now look, I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bitter towards politicians and generals these days, but the truth is that politicians and generals are an immutable fact of the human condition, just like taxes and death. Some are better than others, but all are fallible humans just like you and me. The difference is that politicians and generals are they who find themselves at the inflection points in history where the cost of their decisions is that of human suffering, the only question being whose and how much. But anyway, another reason I decided to make this podcast is because fellow Ranger buddy Richard Cantu of the Over the Top, A Great War podcast has done such an amazing job discussing and exploring World War I that he's truly set the standard for others to follow, and I felt compelled to try and do something similar with Green Hell. Again, that's Over the Top, A Great War podcast by fellow Airborne Ranger and veteran Richard Cantu. If you're at all interested in learning more about World War I, which is a highly glossed over but insane and brutal war, during the next episode, I will be going through World War I to the end of World War II, 1946, as a refresher course and to provide a little historical background so that hopefully by the end of this whole thing, you come away with a holistic perspective on the entire situation. It maybe can be applied to understanding our modern situation. And just going off script here for a second, I just want to say, please bear with me here because, listen, I've never done a podcast before. I'm at least 2 beers deep, maybe 3 by now. Not really keeping track anymore. So if I slur or misspeak on a couple words, please cut me a little slack. There's a lot of reasons I'm making this podcast, but a couple of them are that It gives me an opportunity to practice speaking more clearly and articulating my words a little better. And also, it gives me a reason to do the research, to read the books, and to generate something that will preserve the memory and sacrifices of everybody on all sides that lost their lives in the green hell of Vietnam. But anyway, let me get back on track here. A couple more motivations for why I wanted to do this podcast. I grew up in the early 90s. I spent a lot of time outside, but when I wasn't outside, I was planted in front of the tube. And on Sunday afternoons after church, my parents would go crash out with my little brother. And while they were napping, I would turn on the TV and flip on WB18 or a similar daytime network channel. And I'd catch the Sunday afternoon special. And during these formative years, I watched many vaunted war classics such as Platoon, Delta Force with Chuck Norris, The Longest Day with everybody, Clint Eastwood's in that, A Bridge Too Far, Hamburger Hill, classic, Deer Hunter, classic, Apocalypse Now, perhaps the classic, just to name a few. I would spend my time outside in the backyard digging foxholes when I wasn't watching whatever, probably not great for a kid movie that was on at the time. And there was a ton of these cinder blocks that were left over from something, maybe the pool, that were just piled up in the side yard of my house growing up. And I would take those blocks and I would just like reinforce my fighting position. And then I would have epic battles with little plastic army men in the sand. And, thousands were lost in tunnel collapses, nuclear blasts, comet strikes. All the unfortunate fates that can befall a man happened to my little guys. Some were never found. It was great. But, there was also a lot of playing hide and seek with my friends in the lush tropical backyards of Central Florida. So, the palms, ferns, the citrus trees, the hibiscus trees, it created a jungle feel. There's lizards crawling around everywhere. It's pretty hot. It's humid. It's Florida. It's not Vietnam, but it is kind of a jungle in a lot of ways. So I would imagine myself that I was a CIA spy or commando creeping through the jungle, trying to avoid the enemy. And one time we were playing kickball, or I think I was maybe messing around by myself. I don't remember. I think I was by myself. And I kicked a ball into my next door neighbor, Mr. Gary's backyard. And so I jumped the fence. And while I was back there, I was deep in the bush. And to me, even though I was in my neighbor's backyard, it was the same as an incursion into Laos or Cambodia. And I was trying to retrieve something like a downed pilot. Maybe I saw too many Rambo movies, but it was exhilarating. And, my proverbial Viet Cong, Miss Joe herself, would be back there pruning her bushes pretty close. I'd have my heart in my throat, energy coursing through my body. And I resolved that I would get the mission done without detection. And, I like to believe I did. Probably not. She probably saw me and just pretended that she didn't, but she didn't say anything. So I like to think she never knew I was there. But anyway, when I was in the second grade, I remember the day perfectly, and you'll get where I'm going with this in a minute, but bear with me. I was in music class, and one of my classmates was summoned for early pickup, which means, you got to send a kid with the kid so that they're in a battle buddy pair to the class to get the stuff and then go up front. But then that kid that was his escort, he needs a buddy. So you end up sending 3 kids for 1, or 2 kids rather, plus 1. And so I was one of those escorts, and we went to the classroom, and my teacher, Miss Reese, was crying. Tears were streaming down her face, and she was looking up, holding her mouth at the TV, and it was the Twin Towers burning, falling, and nobody knew what was happening. So I grew up from 8 years old all the way through watching the entire GWAT post 9/11 world unfold. I grew into adolescence having watched the entire saga evolve from the moment the towers were hit to the moment that bin Laden was assassinated. I was in the 11th grade for that. I served in Afghanistan under President Obama, and I saw what happened to the whole situation in 2021. So as you can imagine, my desire is to make sense as best as possible in the historical context of what happened in Afghanistan, what happened in Vietnam. And as a voter, what can I vote for that aligns with the logical lessons that have been learned from these situations abroad? And, I'm not an isolationist. I'm not an expansionist. I won't bring my political opinions into this as best I can. I just think that if we don't ever learn, then we are doomed. And so even though it's a futile quest in many ways to preserve and learn, in many ways for the soldiers that suffered and died there, what else is there other than to preserve and remember what they went through? Because if that's it, then it's an even bigger tragedy to let that memory die with them, because then their suffering was truly for absolutely nothing. And I can't accept that. As an infantryman, I definitely can't accept that. So the Vietnam War obviously influenced me through media and movies, but also through those men in my life that I grew up around that had served in Vietnam. My previously mentioned next door neighbor, Mr. Gary, he was in the Navy during Vietnam, and he was present in the Gulf of Tonkin during that whole situation, which we'll get to in the course of this podcast. My other next door neighbor, Mr. Burns, he was a Marine during Vietnam. And another Marine in my life was my aunt's ex-husband, who I still affectionately refer to as Uncle Vern. He was a Marine, radio guy. One of my favorite karate instructors, Sensei Seeley, he was a combat engineer who would tell us crazy stories of seeing wild tigers and shooting at the VC who were attacking him while he was plowing out an airfield or something to that effect. He suffered long bouts of skin cancer and leukemia through his whole life until he died a few years ago. But he always traced that to Agent Orange exposure. And, there was my dad's best friend, Mr. Ron. He served in Vietnam. He was an infantryman. My dad has told me some pretty intense stories about his situation, which I will bring up soon because his story is definitely representative of the whole situation and kind of a tragic tale in itself. So as a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, which you can also, just lump in with the entire global war on terror, I can't help but see a lot of similarities between my generation's wars and Vietnam era's war. And the irony is that as American politicians and generals failed to heed the lessons learned by the French during their war in Vietnam, it just boggles the mind that we're doing the same thing in the Middle East. But for a 20-year war, granted, the brutality and the body count of GY is nothing compared to pretty much any of the wars. It's still an exercise in futility that cost a lot of people's lives. A lot of people that had a whole bright future ahead of them perished, and they perished because politicians and generals did not have a realistic vision for a beginning, middle, and end to the conflict. They kicked the can down the road for 20 years straight and then just pieced out without having any kind of well-conceived exit strategy. But let me get back to the situation in Vietnam because I can go on a tangent, and I will, as this is my podcast, I will inevitably go on a tangent about Afghanistan, Vietnam, and politicians and generals that I consider to be generally dipshits. So I think that to more comprehensively understand our own age, our own problems, and how we might go about addressing them. It's important to learn that wisdom we can get from the past is invaluable. And the more context we have of the past, the better it is that we're going to understand the present. And so in the next episode, I'm going to crush through some 20th century war history, starting with World War I, going through 1946 and Indochina. We'll touch on Korea a little bit. We'll talk about the Cold War a little bit in broad strokes, and that's going to set the stage for episode 3, which will be the start of the French Indochina series. Real quick before I cut out for the day, I just want to bring up a couple excellent Vietnam documentaries. The first is called The Vietnam War by Ken Burns. It's considered by most, I think, in the modern 2024 era to be the best Vietnam War documentary made to date. And then the History Channel has their Vietnam documentary. It's called Vietnam War in HD. Definitely good. If you want to get 2 Vietnam movies under your belt, if you've never seen them, I highly recommend them. That's going to be Platoon by Oliver Stone, I believe. And the other is Deer Hunter, and I'm not sure who directs that one. But both are classics. Deer Hunter has De Niro, and it's tragic. It's epic. It captures the feel, the tone of Vietnam pretty well. Platoon, I think, is one of the most realistic infantry movies ever made because Oliver Stone himself was an E4 specialist infantryman in Vietnam. So, it's very accurate to the attitudes and characters you meet in a platoon. Plus, a lot of the tactics and weapons are accurately portrayed. Fear of waiting for the enemy to come with the claymore in your hand, and you see some shadowy figures. I mean, the terror of that is pretty well captured by Charlie Sheen. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's why you need to watch the movie Platoon by Oliver Stone. Okay, and one last thing. I want to give a special shout out to the folks over at www.zapsplat.com who provided the sound effects that you've heard today. Until next time, everybody.